Hi there, my name is Caitlin Bandy and this is my channel BandysBooks. Today I am here to talk to you about my November TBR, and let me just tell you I have a lot going on for November. Excuse me first of all if I sound a little bit rough in this video or seem a little bit low energy. I actually am currently sick with COVID. I've been hit back to back unfortunately for like the last several weeks. I had a upper respiratory infection. I had a flare-up of my chronic illness, endometriosis, and then I just got through that and I got hit with COVID a couple of days ago. I've been really lucky so far. I'm feeling not too bad. I am vaccinated and boosted, so it should pass pretty quickly. My doctor did put me on some antivirals just to speed up the process, but I've been really lucky in that I'm mostly just really dealing with fatigue and some pain. So they say that bad luck comes in sets of threes. I've been sick with 3 different things in a month. So I'm hoping that this is the end of it and I'll feel better once this is cleared up. I have a lot of books because I'm trying to do all the things in November. Because I am in quarantine for the next week, I'm maybe possibly overly ambitious with my books this month. I think I can get a lot of reading done in this downtime, so I have a pretty extensive list. Let's go ahead and jump into it. I'm just going to be going through everything really super quickly because, like I said, it's such an extensive list. November. I think everybody has heard of Nonfiction November. I'm super excited about Nonfiction November. I am going to be participating. I have a ton of nonfiction books on my shelf. I'm also going to be participating in Historathon, which is a focus on historical fiction. I have a ton of historical fiction as well, and I really love reading historical fiction. It's one of my favorite genres. So I figured I would put in some books for that as well. And then it's also Indigenous Peoples Week in November. And for me, whenever there is a celebration of a specific culture or group of people, I always like to participate by reading books from that group of people. Of course, I encourage diverse reading throughout the year, and I try my best to be inclusive throughout the year with my reading. But because of Indigenous Peoples Week, I do want to make sure that I highlight some books by Indigenous authors. So the largest chunk of my TBR this month is coming in nonfiction. I know that the Nonfiction November was 4 different prompts. You're supposed to just like fill 4 books that fill those prompts. But I'm using this as an excuse to clear a whole bunch of nonfiction off of my shelf. You may be questioning my sanity when you hear the quantity of books for my overall TBR this month, but keep in mind that a lot of these books are really, really small. So I should be able to read them relatively quickly. And also, like I said, I'm at home in quarantine for at least the next week. So it should give me a lot of good reading time. So let's jump into the nonfiction part first. So a couple books that I have on my library list that should be coming through this month. I have Lost to the World by Shahbaz Taseer. This is a book about a gentleman, or it's his memoir, and he is essentially kidnapped by the Islamic movement for Uzbekistan and held captive. He comes out in support of this Christian woman who is accused of blasphemy, and because of defending her, he's accused of blasphemy as well and is locked in prison. He's tortured, brutalized, and this is his memoir of his survival of these experiences. After that, I have Dear Santhurin by Akwaeke Emeze. I have been reading a few of Akwaeke Emeze's books in the last couple months. I've been going through buddy reading them all with my friend Ali Loves to Read. She's over on Instagram and she is a lovely person, super diverse reader. So this month we decided that we would buddy read Dear Santhurin, which is Akwaeke Emeze's memoir. I have heard wonderful things about it, that it's a very unique memoir, that their perspective of the world is just completely different from everyone else. And I mean, in some ways I can see that in their writing, but I am really excited to read specifically about their experiences around gender, around identity, around writing and being an author, all of this. I'm really looking forward to getting into that. And then I have I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. I'm sure most of you are probably aware of this memoir by now. I think this has been one of the most hyped books recently, or at least the most hyped memoir recently. Jeanette McCurdy was a child actress. She had what sounds like a very troubled childhood, and she has some disenchanting views on her childhood fame and her acting and all of the things that she was involved in. My coworker actually recently listened to it on audiobook and said it was really good. and that as someone who grew up watching Jeanette McCurdy as an actress, she really appreciated it. I personally did not watch any of the shows that Jeanette McCurdy was on, but I'm still very interested in it. I think the childhood actress thing is very interesting, and I love when people explore their family dynamics. Next up, I have Sissy, a coming of gender story by Jacob Tobiah. This is Jacob's story about their experiences growing up and finding their way in life. They are labeled as a sissy for liking feminine things and being a little more feminine presenting, I guess, and coming to terms with what being a sissy means. I am looking forward to getting into this. Also, it's a pretty short read, so I think this would be a pretty quick one for me. Then I have Blood Orange Night by Melissa Bond. This is a memoir about a woman who is suffering from a benzodiazepine addiction. Melissa's life begins to suffer. She loses her job, her relationship with her husband is strained, and her doctor is prescribing benzodiazepines to put her to sleep. Eventually, she does find out that, like many people, she has been over-prescribed a medication that should have only been used temporarily or not used at all. And this is her story about that. Then I have Tell Me Everything, the story of a private investigation by Erica Krause. So this is a memoir. Erica is assigned as a private investigator to a case about sexual assault. As Erica gets further and further into this case, like 5 years down the road, the scandal that she's investigating implodes, but so does her life, and she's kind of trying to figure out how to balance the need of the case and the need of her life. After that, I have The Power of Dignity, How Transforming Justice Can Heal Our Communities by Judge Victoria Pratt. This is a book that I was given by Seal Press. If you're unfamiliar with Seal Press, they do publish exclusively nonfiction books, and they have a tendency to publish books that are more current themes, a lot of social justice, a lot of reform, gender identity, race, sexuality, things like that. I really like it. I've gotten quite a few books from them as a Seal ambassador, and all of them have been pretty good quality. I've been really impressed, and there's such a diverse range of books. I found things that I've read about that I didn't really think that much about before. This is a good example of one that I think will open my eyes a bit. So Judge Victoria Pratt is Black and Latina, and as a judge, she finds that her number one rule is finding compassion, empathy, and dignity with all of the people that she deals with. She thinks that treating anyone that enters her courtroom with dignity is the most important part of her practice, and this is about how incorporating dignity into our justice system can reform it. After that, I have The Color of the Elephant, a memoir of Mzungu by Christine Herbert. This is an indie book that I was recently sent, and it is about Christine's travel in the Peace Corps. She goes to Zambia and has experience of a lifetime, and this book explores all of that. I'm really excited about this because I love to travel. Africa is one of the continents that I have not gotten to yet, although I'm hoping that'll change next year because Oz and I want to go home and visit his family who's in Angola, next door to Zambia. So I'm looking forward to getting to know a little bit more about Zambia. After that is a book that was actually recommended by my father, and that's A Woman of No Importance, The Untold Story of the American Spy Who Helped Win World War II by Sonia Purnell. So this is about a woman who becomes a spy in World War II, and she is effective as a spy because women really weren't believed at the time to be capable of being spies. And so this is all, of course, about, her experience as a spy, but also her experience of becoming a spy and why she was so effective. I'm really looking forward to this. I think this will be a really unique piece of history. Next up, I have Four Brown Girls with Sharp Edges and Tender Hearts, A Love Letter to Women of Color by Prisa Dorcas Mojica Rodriguez. So this is a book, obviously it's not written specifically for me as an audience, but I'm hoping that this will make me more empathetic and broaden my viewpoints. Prisa is the founder of Latina Rebels, and her goal is to help liberate women of color. So she, in this book, is addressing things like imposter syndrome, colorism, decolonizing your worldview, and defying universal white narratives. So I am looking forward to reading this. This is another book that was sent to me by Seal Press. Like I said, they tend to pick a lot of really current modern themes for their books, and all of them have been excellent so far, so I'm sure this one's going to be really good as well. And while we're on a Seal Press theme, I also have Listen World, How the Intrepid Elsie Robinson Became America's Most Read Woman by Julie Shears and Allison Gilbert. So this book is about Elsie Robinson. At 35, she finds herself in a scandalous divorce. It's 1917, so, especially scandalous considering the time. She has no way to support herself and her chronically ill son. She takes up swinging a pickaxe in a mine to try to make money to keep them alive. And then the mine shuts down. She takes a leap of faith and moves to San Francisco, where she is eventually hired on as a writer and becomes a extremely famous columnist. So I'm really looking forward to this. This is a bit of unknown history to me, and I love reading about badass women who just kind of carve their own paths in life. I think this is going to be phenomenally good. After that, I have Notes on a Silencing by Lacey Crawford. This has popped up in other TBRs before. This is about Lacey's experience with sexual abuse. So the elite St. Paul's school comes under state investigation after extensive reports of sexual abuse on campus. Lacey thought she'd put all of her history with that school behind her, but when these reports come up, it drags all of that history back up, and she has to face what she's experienced. From there, we're going to move into Signs of Resistance, American Deaf Cultural History, 1900 to World War II by Susan Birch. This is a fairly short book, but it looks like it's very detailed. It's got a ton of notes and citations. And the way that I understand this is it's just a summary of the history of deaf culture. I don't know as much about the history of deaf culture as I should, so I'm actually quite interested in reading this and learning a bit more. Next up, I have Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance. It's a memoir of a family and culture in crisis. I've been seeing this book all over the place. I know that it's a bestseller from the New York Times. I know it's been made into a film. And I believe that this is exploring the cultural crisis and the disintegration of poor to middle class rural white Americans. I believe that the focus on this book is in Appalachia, and I think JD talks about his family and that his grandparents were dirt poor and in love, and they moved to Appalachia. And then eventually they go to Ohio trying to escape the dreadful poverty around them. They raise a middle class family, eventually even sending one of their grandchildren to Yale. I think this book kind of explores that even though the family kind of makes it into middle class, they still struggle with alcoholism, abuse. I've heard really good things about this. I've heard it's a very moving book. Next up, I have Glass Castles by Jeanette Walls. This is about Jeanette's life growing up. Initially, her family is fairly stable, but her father's alcoholism gets out of hand. He ends up moving her family to a small West Virginia town, struggling immensely with his alcoholism, stealing grocery money, leaving the family bereft, and Jeanette and her siblings really struggle to get through it. I've heard that this is also a really heartbreaking book. After that, I have In the Weeds, Around the World and Behind the Scenes with Anthony Bourdain by Tom Vitale. This is about Anthony Bourdain and his show. I believe Tom Vitale was one of the producers on the show, if I remember correctly, and it's just his experiences, his views of things. I have read that this is definitely not like a glamorization of Bourdain. It's a more straightforward telling about, how he was as a human, how he could be really selfish and grumpy and hard to work with, how he could also be wonderful and charismatic and amazing. And I've just heard really good things about this. I'm looking forward to this. Next up, I have Nomadland by Jessica Bruder. It's Surviving America in the 21st Century. So I believe that this discusses sort of the underbelly of an American economy. There are all sorts of people that live a more transient lifestyle, living out of vans, trailers, camping, whichever, and they take on temporary jobs from location to location and they move around, which honestly to me sounds amazing. I would love to do the van life someday. This just explores both the good and the bad, the creativity that comes with it, the artistic expression and cool communities, but also the downside of it, the economic effects, the ability of people to take advantage of people that are transient workers, things like that. I know that this is now a movie as well, and I'm looking forward to getting into this. I've considered the nomad life myself, so I'm curious to see what this has to say. Then I have Unmasked, My Life Solving America's Cold Cases by Paul Holes with Robin Gabby Fisher. I received this as an ARC, and I just unfortunately didn't get to it in time, but I've heard good things about it. I know that this was really popular when it was released, and it is a memoir of Paul and his experience solving America's cold cases. I am a huge true crime fan. I've read, especially when I was younger, read a ton of true crime. Then I have The Choice by Dr. Edith Eva Eger. This is about a young girl who at the age of 16 is sent to Auschwitz Hours after her parents are murdered, Nazi officer Dr. Joseph Mengele forces her to dance for his amusement and her survival. She was pulled from a pile of corpses when American troops liberated the camps in 1945. She spends decades struggling with flashbacks and survivor's guilt. She's determined to stay silent and hide from the past, but 35 years after the war ended, she returns to Auschwitz and is finally able to fully heal and forgive the one person she'd been unable to forgive, which is herself. Continuing with the Holocaust theme, we have Night by Elie Wiesel. This book was a winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. So Elie Wiesel was sent to Auschwitz as a teenager in 1944, and then later to Buchenwald. His whole family was killed, and this is a record of his family's death and the death of his own innocence and his despair as a deeply observant Jew confronting the absolute evil of man. After that, I have Angela's Ashes by Frank McCourt, which was a winner of the Pulitzer Prize, and this, I believe, is a memoir about Frank McCourt's life growing up. I know that this was also made into a motion picture, and I don't know that much else about it. I believe, if I remember correctly, this is about poverty and growing up within that poverty, but I'm not entirely sure. So this would be probably one of the ones that I'm going in a little more blind with. And the last book for the nonfiction portion of this TBR is Black Skinhead: Reflections on Blackness and Our Political Future by Brandy Collins Dexter. I won this off of Goodreads, and this sounds super interesting to me. It is a discussion of politics in relation to the Black vote, specifically the fragile alliance between the Democratic Party and Black voters as a whole. It does go into topics such as music, film, sports, and the baffling mind of Kanye West. It relies a lot on voter statistics and things like that. Now we're gonna jump over into historical fiction. I have The People of Ostrich Mountain by Ndirongo Gathaiga. This book is set in 1950 in Kenya after the Mau Mau Revolution. It follows the main character, Wanbui, as she leaves her little village and heads off to go get an education at a school. Turns out that she's a math prodigy, and teachers have really high expectations for her. She actually ends up befriending one of her professors at the school, and they have a lifelong friendship. Eventually, Wanbui decides that she's going to head back to her village and teach the students there, spread the education. And then later in the book, it follows her son, who actually ends up becoming a doctor and immigrating to the United States. So we have a multi-generational family saga set in Kenya starting in 1950. I think this is going to be so cool. I actually haven't read any books set in Kenya, and particularly like in that time frame, I feel like the historical element is really cool. I'm very interested in learning about the Mau Mau Revolution, more about Kenya. I know that it was a colony, I believe a British colony, and so I think it'll touch on colonialism and things like that as well. Also, interesting piece of history, so I'm looking forward to this one quite a bit. I have also The Island of Sea Women by Lisa C. This is set in Jeju Island, Korea, and it is a multi-generational saga as well. It talks about the women on the island who learn to dive and provide for their families and all of that. I am very interested. I am a rescue scuba diver, and I am very, very much into diving, so I'm really interested in this bit of history about that. Next up, I have Hester by Lori Lico Albanese. This is about a woman who immigrates from Scotland to the United States around the 1800s at some point. When she arrives in the United States, her husband takes off on her, and she's left to grapple with what to do. She ends up falling in love with another man, and they become kind of a muse and artist situation, and eventually she kind of has to grapple with the history of the United States and what she's going to do with her life there. I have heard rave reviews about this book, so I'm really looking forward to getting into it. After that, I have Take My Hand by Dolan Perkins Valdez. This is set in 1973. We have a main character named Sybil, who is a nurse and fresh out of nursing school at the time. She is fighting for reproductive rights for her patients, and she specifically gets tied up with a family where there's a couple young girls. Family's like, I want to say like 11 or 13 people in the family. And it becomes really clear to her that it's really important that these children have access to birth control. It alludes to something serious happening and causing a bit of a, I don't know if it's like a rift between the family and her or what exactly, but later on in life, she's gonna have to deal with the repercussions of the situation. I'm really looking forward to this one. I've also heard it's really good, and I feel like it's an incredibly important book and piece of history right now, considering the current political climate around reproductive rights here in the United States. After that, I have The Night Ship by Just Kid. This is a dual timeline with like one timeline set in the past and one timeline set closer to the present. And it focuses on a shipwreck on an Australian island. I think in the past, there is a girl that gets shipwrecked on this island, and it's about her surviving on this island, or And then the current timeline is about somebody being on the island and discovering the remains of the shipwreck. So I'm really looking forward to getting into this. I've never read Just Kids Writing before, but I have heard amazing things. I think this is going to be a really good one. Next up is The Beekeeper of Aleppo by Christy Lefteri. This is a book about a man named Nuri who is a beekeeper in Syria. He and his wife live pretty peaceful. They have a routine of keeping bees during the week and going to the souk on the weekends to, check out the goods, sell things. And then, Syria is destroyed by war, and Nuri and his wife take off and go through the process of trying to immigrate to Britain. Nuri is trying to deal with the uncertainty of his future in Britain, but also his wife's grief. Next up, I have The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. I didn't actually originally have this book on the list, but my mom, when she found out I was doing historical fiction, was like, if you read one book this month for historical fiction, make sure it's The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. I did have this thing on the shelves, so I was like, all right, whatever, what's one more book? Let's throw it in. So this follows two different women. Vianne, whose husband has left France to go fight in the war. She is thinking that she's going to be safe throughout the war, that the Nazis won't invade France, but they eventually do invade, of course, and they requisition her home for soldiers. So she and her daughters are living in the home while Nazi soldiers are also living there. She has to make just unthinkable decisions to survive and to keep her family safe. And then she has a younger sister named Isabel, who is 18 years old. She's searching for her purpose in life, like most 18-year-olds are. She falls in love with a man named Gaetan, a partisan who believes the French can fight the Nazis from within. When he betrays her, she decides to join the resistance, and she puts herself in extraordinary danger to fight back against the Nazis. Again, I've heard this book is amazing, not just from my mom, but from many, many people. I've heard it's also a really big tearjerker. After that, I have The Orphan Thief by Glynis Peters. This is about a main character named Ruby. Her whole family is killed when the Germans are bombing Britain, and she isn't sure how she's going to survive. And then she meets a street urchin named Tommy, and he gives her just the chance that she needs. After that, I have The Alice Network by Katie Quinn. I love Katie Quinn's writing. I read The Diamond Eye earlier this year, which was fantastic. I read The Rose Code. I'm a big fan of historical fiction in general, but I think Katie Quinn does a phenomenal job of writing historical fiction, also specifically writing really strong heroines in her historical fiction. This one, from what I understand, is about two different timelines. So we have a World War II timeline where Charlie St. Clair is pregnant and unmarried, on the verge of being thrown out by her very proper family. She's nursing a desperate hope that her beloved cousin Rose, who disappeared in Nazi-occupied France during the war, might still be alive. When her parents banish her to Europe to have her little problem taken care of, Charlie breaks free and heads to London, determined to find out what happened to the cousin she loves like a sister. Then we have a 1915 timeline where Ava Gardner burns to join the fight against the Germans and unexpectedly gets her chance when she's recruited to work as a spy. She gets sent into occupied France, and she's trained by the mesmerizing Lily, codename Alice, the queen of spies, who manages a vast network of secret agents right under the enemy's nose. 30 years later, haunted by the betrayal that ultimately tore apart the Alice Network, Eve spends her days drunk and secluded in her crumbling London house. That is, until a young American barges in, uttering a name Eve hasn't heard in decades. I'm really looking forward to this. I love that there is a World War I and World War II timeline tied together. I love the idea of lady spies. I think this is going to be awesome. And then I have On a Night of 1,000 Stars by Andrea Yayura Clark. So this is about La Guerra Sucia, which means the dirty war, in Argentina. I have an odd amount of knowledge about La Guerra Sucia and Argentinian politics in this time period, because when I was in college, before I went to culinary school, okay, this requires a bit of a story. So I finished high school before I was 18, and my dad did not want me to move away to Las Vegas to go to culinary school right away. So they insisted I enroll at the local community college and take some courses until I could leave for culinary school. I decided to take a bunch of linguistics. So I decided to take a Spanish speech class as one of my classes. And the professor that was teaching the class was basically requiring us to make speeches about different subjects. So at one point, somebody gave a speech on La Guerra Sucia. And then later on in that semester, there was a speaker at the college, Alicia Partenoy, and she was a survivor of one of the concentration camps in the Dirty War in Argentina. And I became interested in this, and I found her book. I read all about it, and I guess what really shook me at the time was that this was such a big thing. There was like thousands upon thousands upon thousands of disappeared people. There was concentration camps, there was brutality, torture, rape, and it was something I had never heard of. I think I was 17 or 18 at the time, and I considered myself fairly well read in history. My dad would lecture, about history over the dinner table. I felt like I was fairly knowledgeable, and here was this whole huge chunk of history that I had never even heard of. And that set me on a course of learning about, I guess, I don't want to say more obscure historical events because they're not obscure. Just, I guess I mean from the perspective of American history that they're more obscure, because here obviously we don't get taught the world history in the way that we should. Our history here is very insular, unless you're talking about like World War II era. So I started doing tons of research into South American history, Asian history, African history, etc. And especially now, I've done a lot of traveling through South America and Central America, and I've learned a ton of the history that doesn't get taught up here. When this book came out, I was really excited. My mom picked up a copy, and when she finished it, she passed it on to me. I'm really looking forward to getting into this. This does deal with La Guerra Sucia and that whole situation in Argentina. After that, I have Remembrance by Rita Woods. I'm really interested in this book. I love that the first character is a Haitian immigrant, and I'm curious to see what her experience is coming to the United States and how she finds things post-earthquake. And then the second timeline being set in the Haitian Revolution. I'm super interested in that part in particular. I do know a little bit about Haiti's revolution and them being the first country to overthrow slavery and declare independence from their enslavers. I am specifically really interested in that piece of history. After that, I have The Librarian of Auschwitz by Antonio Iturbe, translated by Lilith Zekulin Thwaites. This is a book about a 14-year-old girl named Dita. She's imprisoned by the Nazis at Auschwitz. The prisoners there entrust her with books. I believe she ends up with 12 of them, and she has to make all sorts of sacrifices to keep these books safe. And then I have The Mountains Sing by Nguyen Phan Ke Mai. This is about Vietnam, and it follows 4 generations of the Tran family through the eyes of the matriarch Tran Du Lan and her granddaughter Huang. Du Lan is forced by the communists to flee her family's prosperous farm during the land reform in 1955. With 5 of her 6 children, she embarks on a perilous journey to keep them safe and is forced to make unthinkable choices along the way. Years later in Hanoi, she survives the American bombardment with young Huang, whose parents and uncles have left to fight in the conflict that continues to tear both her family and her beloved country apart. I've also heard that this is excellent. I am looking forward to getting into it, even though I know it's going to be a really sad book. Next up is the part of my TBR featuring books by Indigenous authors. I have a handful of books selected for this, and there's a couple books that are going to cross over into the nonfiction TBR and a couple that are going to cross into the historical fiction TBR. I did do that intentionally. I think whenever we're reading books specifically about a certain group of people, it's important to not only read fiction, but to read nonfiction as well. So I always try to incorporate a couple nonfiction books. And because historical fiction was the second part of this theme, there's some crossover there as well. The first book that I have is The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. This is a story about 4 young Native American men who, when they're children, basically have a certain experience, and as adults, it comes back to haunt them and puts them into a struggle for their lives. I've heard that this has kind of Jordan Peele vibes in terms of like Get Out and that sort of suspense. I'm really looking forward to it. I've heard this is an excellent book, and since we're just getting out of spooky season, I'm here for it. After that, I have Woman of Light by Callie Fajardo Ansteen. This is a multi-generational story following 5 different generations of a indigenous Chicano family in the American Southwest. After that, I have There by Tommy Orange. This features 12 indigenous characters all traveling to the same powwow, and their stories are all somehow interconnected. I've heard that this one is phenomenally good, and I'm really looking forward to getting into it. After that, I have a book called Fool's Crow by James Welch. I had actually never heard of this book before, and in doing a little bit of research, I found out that James Welch was one of the prominent authors / poets in the Native American Renaissance, and that this book in particular was one of his well-known works. It features a leader of a Blackfeet tribe who is struggling to lead his tribe through the white invasion. So in my nonfiction selections, I have The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee by David Truer. This is a book that discusses Native culture and Native history from Wounded Knee to present day. What I understand from this book is that there is this perception when discussing Native American history that everything stops after Wounded Knee. and that there's not a lot of modern historical stuff written. So this discusses all of that modern cultural evolution, all of the things that happen after Wounded Knee until current day. I'm really looking forward to getting into this because I know I'm going to learn a lot. And then I have Lakota Woman by Mary Crow Dog. This is a book that was also recommended to me by my dad, and this is about Mary's personal experiences growing up on a reservation. I believe it's called the Rosebud Indian Reservation, and she is in some horrific schools, dealing with poverty, abuse, all sorts of things. And I know it's a really tragic story. I don't know much else about it. My dad said that it was very moving and very powerful. So I was able to find a copy of the book, and I am looking forward to reading it, even though I know it's going to be difficult. And the last two books, I have The Plague of Doves by Louise Erdrich. I have a hit and miss relationship with Louise Erdrich. I read The Sentence maybe last year, and I really enjoyed The Sentence. And then I read The Watchmen, didn't love that one so much. This book I'm hoping is going to be a win for me. This is about a crime that is committed in a small white town near an Ojibwe nation in South Dakota. The people living in the white town react and blame the crime on some indigenous men, and this book is told or talks about that specific instance through the view of several different people. And finally, Winter Counts by David Heska Wambley-Waden. This is a thriller, and it is about Virgil Wounded Horse, who's a local enforcer on the Rosebud Indian Reservation in South Dakota. When justice is denied by the American legal system or the tribal council, Virgil is hired to deliver his own punishment, the kind that's hard to forget. But when heroin makes its way onto the reservation and finds Virgil's nephew, his vigilantism suddenly becomes personal. So those are all the many books that are on my TBR for November. As you can see, I have a ton of nonfiction, a decent amount of historical fiction, and a decent amount of books by Indigenous authors. I'm really excited about how diverse this TBR is. I feel like it covers a lot of different topics. So let me know what's on your TBR this month in the comments down below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this video. And if you're not already subscribed, hit the subscribe button so you never miss one of my videos. Thank you again for being patient with me for the last couple weeks while I have been sick. My name is Caitlin Bandy. This is my channel, Bandys Books. See you in the next one. Bye.